Everybody, and welcome to another episode of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this exciting edition, I am talking with author and artist Peter Kuper. Peter, thank you so much for taking some time on a busy Friday night to talk with me.
My pleasure.
And we were discussing your impressive mask collection, which to folks watching the video, they can absolutely enjoy that as well. So hopefully there's a smile on your face at the end, and it's not the was that decaf one that's right above your head there by the end of the conversation. I hope anyway. All right. So my first question for you is you have this distinctive style, you have this wonderful way of looking at the world and representing it. What was it about comics and visual creating that drew you in?
My first interest was entomology. I thought I would be an entomologist, really interested in insects. I think it's just, I have a visual, I'm not a believer in the word talent, but I do think that we all individually have things that draw us. Some people are much more musical. Some people are like math. I definitely was visually oriented, and insects were just incredibly engaging to me in all aspects of them. Just the colors, the movement, the shapes. They all seemed like fantasy objects, and comics had that same thing going on, and it kind of knocked my entomology enthusiasm to one side, not out, but to one side. And when I was about 7, I saw a Thor Jack Kirby Stan Lee comic, and I just completely, knocked me out. And I was
Uh,
super shocked when he dies at the end. And then I just thought, that's it. I got very first issue I got, and he's already dead. And then he came back, which was super exciting. The dynamics of the art, the way, the storytelling, everything that was going on, the color, and especially with masterful artists like Jack Kirby, it just made my blood run faster. And I, I think that interest went along and maybe faded a little bit. But then when I was 10, my father, who was a professor, had a sabbatical year, and we moved to Israel. And I was I was about to be probably a reasonably popular, semi-mediocre person. And when I got to Israel, I was at the bottom of the food chain, got beat up a lot. The teacher didn't like Americans. The students absolutely didn't like an interloper outsider. And I spent a lot of time in the school hall, and I started reading more comics then. And I read pretty broadly. I was really into Harvey comics, Richie Rich, Little Dot, Little Lotta, Hot Stuff, etc. And then also Batman and what I could get my hands on. And when I got back to the United States, age 11, um, the only person I could relate to was the other kid who got beat up a lot and who was really into comics. And that was my friend Seth DeBachman, who stayed, I met in first grade, and we stayed friends, and we ended up starting a fanzine together when we were 11. And got really lucky because there was some fandom. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and there was some fandom there. And we saw that there was a comic convention in Detroit. And so in 1970, I went to my first comic book convention, and I just was utterly taken by everything about it. Jim Stranko was the big guest, along with Bernie Wrightson, who was a 19-year-old, probably
mm,
brand new there. It was it was like early enough in the whole field that all of that was available. And I looked around, and this was it as far as I was concerned. And my whole year was devoted to getting a little bit of capital together, and trying to not fail all my classes so that I could go to the New York Comic Convention, which I started going to in 1971. And doing a fanzine meant that I could, my Seth and I could interview people. So we were like, one year we interviewed Jack Kirby, we interviewed William Gaines,
Mm.
um, Neil Adams, Joe Sinnott, inker on Fantastic Four. I met Frazetta. So it was like the whole swimming in the sea of cartoonists at a point where it was still a really modest scene. Like there was a few thousand people that went to the New York Comic Convention, and then basically all these incredible creators would go there to meet, to hang out with each other. And you could
Mhm.
just walk up to Will Eisner and chat with him, or Harvey Kurtzman, or you name it. They were all alive and around, and more than a little available. To say, hey, Mr. Gaines, publisher of Mad Magazine, can I interview? And you, sure, let's go upstairs, sit at this little cart table, and I had my little recorder, and we published these interviews in the fanzine. And it was just like, you know, there was just so many different things that were introductions, and I didn't draw really at all. I had no notable skills. I attempted to copy this and that, but in general, there was nothing to indicate that I would end up being a cartoonist. But not to make a short story long, when I was 15, I just started to lose interest in comics. I was, hitting puberty. I was like, the girls in comics aren't mixing, like I'm not like winning any contests by like showing my comic collection. And right about that time, I got mono, and I was in bed for about a month. And I had just stopped collecting comics, where I had been a weekly collector. And the friends that I had that were into comics went out, got all the comics that I had missed, brought them, and I spent that month in bed reading comics. And when I got out of bed, I was like, Dad, I want to be a cartoonist. And he was like, okay, do a drawing a week for me. And I think I did one, and then proceeded not to get any further. But my interest was back. And around that, in that similar time, probably around the time I started smoking pot, uh, underground comics, which were around. I mean, I saw Crumb's work in 1970 at this Detroit Triple Fanfare, and I immediately was taken with it. It was one of those odd things because it was outside of the scope of superheroes that I was into, but there was
Mhm.
just that his drawing just grabbed me immediately. And I was coming back from buying comics. Actually, this is a roll back a little bit. Um, and I had my comics in my hand, and a kid walking by said, "Oh, I see you have comics. There's a guy over here who has some comics in that building. Um, his name's Harvey Picar." This was in 1972, I believe. And I went and buzzed the buzzer that said Harvey Picar and said, "I understand you have comics. Can I come up?" And he invited me up. And he wasn't doing American Splendor. He didn't do that until 1976. Um, he showed me some original R. Crumb work. It was a guy peeing into a toilet, and you saw his genitals, which I'd never seen in
Mhm.
cartoons. And it just absolutely was like, okay, new world. I was still young. I hadn't even hit puberty. So I was still, it was all revelatory. And Harvey was like extremely nice to me and to Seth. And he looked at our fanzine and he gave us some suggestions. We met an artist, Gary Dumb, who worked at a local bookstore, who ended up being one of the main artists on American Splendor. He did work for our fanzine starting in as early as 1970. So he's a really, anyway, I don't know if there's something in the water in Cleveland. Siegel and Schuster were there.
Yeah, yeah.
Don and Maggie Thompson were there. There was Crumb lived there, and Crumb came through town and visited Harvey, and I got to meet him. He did a drawing for our fanzine, did the cover. So there was just a lot of luck involved, and also, but my level of enthusiasm was, fortunately, turned into a passion that wasn't quitting at all. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
that was a very long answer to your brief question. I could go on.
Fascinating. I love the just the interconnected web of folks that you crossed paths with, and I just went to my first Comic Con last summer. I'd never been to a convention. This was Heroes Con in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it is just this. It's fandom. I mean, I don't know what other word to put on it because you get to meet creators, and I spent most of my time going in the artist alley and seeing just who was there and who would come different days and stuff. But then you have all of the memorabilia around and all of those pieces. The other thing that you mentioned is your attraction with entomology, and then how perfect that you adapt metamorphosis.
Indeed. Yeah. It it's funny, I teach also, and I one of the things I say right off the bat is like, what's your passion? And I'm like, it's a big question, really, because a lot of people just haven't identified that. And as somebody who fortunately has more than one passion, even I even forgot what my passions were, and I forgot how important insects were in my as a passion. And I've come around to that, and I'll get to this a little later. But um, I'm still fascinated by insects, and that what I wish upon any student, anybody, is to have passions and to be able to identify them and have them and I always say, like, if you're into sports, which I am totally not, oh fine, you're into cars, you're into horses, whatever it may be, that if you can identify things that matter to you like that, that's the kind of thing. And ideally a Venn diagram between more than one thing that then becomes, like a hybrid, which is where I'm heading and looking to find more originality in a certain way, that to bring in different sources so that then you end up arriving at someplace like, in my case, comics and insects. Good meeting, metamorphosis being, an aspect of that.
Mhm. Yeah, but then I'm also thinking about the system. I'm thinking about the other book you did about Kafka. Just thinking about your style and how those pieces come together. Kafka-esque, I think, is what it was called.
Kafkaesque is a more recent collection. Also,
Mhm.
I did a book called Ruins, and there's
Mhm.
a huge section in there that's just about the monarchs' migration from Canada to Mexico. And that was the kind of the tip of the ice, or the tipping point of where I like, oh wait, I'm so interested in insects. And it was one of the parts of the book while I was working on it. I was just like pure joy because it was
Yeah.
comics and insects. And the combo passion was then become sort of an Uber thing. And I just, there's sort of no end to how much I can sustain a work that could go on for, well, years that's on
Yeah.
subjects.
And then you also have Heart of Darkness, which looks very charcoal. That's kind of the impression that I get from the pages in it. It has that sort of like uh I don't know if you call it washed or how you would
Yeah,
describe it,
it
but
was. Well,
yeah.
it was, I used a black Prismacolor pencil, for the sections of it that are telling the story about the up river trip, and
Mhm.
then sort of real time is in pen and ink, digitally toned with grays. But then the other part that's telling the story, I actually did, watercolor on it. It was the Prismacolor pencil and then watercolor, black, black and white, but watercolor nonetheless. I find, like I have a very fluid style choices, and I have now so many different styles to choose from, and I feel very fortunate because this is something I struggled with a lot over the years because when somebody hires you to do a job, and especially a lot of my work when I was starting out was in illustration, they
Mm.
anticipate the style. So if I show them my work and I show a black and white, like woodcut look, and then I come in with watercolor, they're not going to be pleased. I've managed to, over the years, uh, develop a lot of different styles, including stencils and spray paint, as I did with The System and Sticks and Stones and Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, my first adaptation.
Mhm,
Uh,
mhm.
and then Scratchboard, which is an approximation of woodcut that I did for the Kafka stories, which seemed very appropriate for a kind of German expressionist reference. And I really, that has come quite naturally. It's like if I find the subject matter dictating what style is appropriate. So with Heart of Darkness, the kind of more sketchbook quality for the tale of going upriver and what happens on that journey. I was looking towards my sketchbooks, which I keep steadily,
Mm.
and that's much more of I'm using watercolor, and that's also a mishmash, and it's one of the ways that I created time, usually traveling. I did a lot of traveling over the years, uh, to just draw on a sketchbook and not have any commerce involved, not have any art director wondering what style I was going to draw on, and see what happened. And I found collage, and when you're traveling, you have all these maps coming in. I had my glue stick, and I would glue a piece of a map down or a ticket or something, and then draw around that. And that, sort of it was things that naturally occurred. That's, it's more arty, and I don't think of myself, in strictly like in fine arts terms. I've been a commercial artist. That is to say, I do work that like tell somebody I'm going to do something and I get paid for it, and they tell me what they're going to pay me,
Mhm.
and not just the fine art, where you create and then hope somebody's interested. Although, I have certainly done plenty of that as well. But I've really tried to have my style be as fluid as it needs to be for whatever it is. Let the story that I want to tell dictate what's an appropriate style. And sometimes, that can just be being more cartoony or being more realistic, or everything in between.
I love that kind of back and forth in Heart of Darkness of kind of that ethereal quality because when you travel, you're sort of outside of yourself and that nothing is quite permanent because you're not home. And so I love that visual representation of that between the present ongoing story and the travel kind of aspect of it.
No, I mean, that's why one of the things that drew me, no pun intended, to travel was that quality of, you arrive in a place, and you're just like a newborn, and you're seeing it. An artist that I really love is Saul Steinberg. He did the famous New Yorker cover that was like, uh, Fifth Avenue, 10th Avenue, and the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And he's one of those stylists that he just works in oil painting and collage and does uh, um, constructions and whatever. And he's a big traveler also, and he had that quality of looking at a place and then seeing it through these new eyes. And he did that with New York, and in many ways, I felt like I was seeing New York through his eyes. Like he'd draw like an oil spill on the street was that rainbow color that you get when oil hits water, and he did these little rainbows around. I was just like, oh yeah, it's the way Andy Warhol walked into a grocery store and just saw it. Like, wait a minute, this repetition is a thing, and it's a comment on commerce and capitalism, and like how you can fold those things into it, and have conceptual response to the environment, and at the same time just observation.
That's a great segue to the question I had for you about the social and political possibilities in comics. It was sometime over the past few years, I think during the pandemic, I heard you do a talk on that. So I wanted to kind of hat tip that talk, but also give you the chance to kind of explore that a little bit for listeners of, sometimes comics are seen as this simple thing, but they actually can comment on life and visual arts can comment on life in these really amazingly complex ways.
Well, I mean, just for starters, comics are the most complicated art form because it's demanding that a quality. If you have all the pieces together, it means you have to be lettering, designing, drawing, writing. I mean, there aren't, I guess if you're an auteur or filmmaker, that you're doing that if you're holding the camera as well. If you're doing a play and you're directing actors, but you're creating the performers. Let's say if you're doing a story, and if you are an auteur and you do all the pieces of it, you're really having to juggle a tremendous amount of different abilities and disciplines. So that's it's one of the ironies that comics were considered, oh well, that's for kids and all that. That's the easy dismissal that I saw a lot in the art world until they went, oops, wait a minute. Graphic novels are like perhaps the most for bookstores, they became the number one best-selling thing, and for publishers too. And having been around for a good section of time where that wasn't the case, where bringing a graphic novel to a publisher, they looked at you like you had brought in a dirty diaper, and it was just really. And this same people ended up publishing my work later. So it's one of those things, which
Right.
I'm glad I was alive to experience that. A lot of the artists who were doing that, were Eisner maybe was one that he stuck around long enough to coin the term graphic novel and get to experience some success in that area. But there were a lot of people doing amazing work that just barely did that. I mean, somebody like Harvey Kurtzman, creator of Mad, he did all sorts of graphic novel things and was trying to get people to recognize that this was could be an adult form, and was absolutely blocked in many ways, and obviously no doubt to his deepest frustrations. But to get to the political aspect of it, virtually there's nothing you can't do with comics, of course, but in many ways with cartooning, comic books, but also editorial cartoons and all that. And I also, part of having a career is, and really this is the result of my own interests, I range around. So I do gag cartoons, I do editorial cartoons, illustration, comic books, and graphic novels. And that, and actually it's not just because I'm trying to have make a living, but also because all of those are really interesting to me and have always been areas that are like vibrant and I want to try. I mean, I think that maybe relates to my inability to land on one style, is also my desire to try, and the same thing is true in my graphic novels. I've done autobiography, I've done tons of fiction, adaptations, biographies, you name that area. But it's really just coming from like the form is so wide open and it's so capable of doing all those things that something will pique my interest and I'll be like, oh yeah, I want to try that area, and then it's like refreshed. I had a moment where I just suddenly found myself like I have a buildup of gag cartoon ideas, and I started pitching to the New Yorker, and I had pitched to them over the years. It was one of the first places that I pitched when I was probably still in art school, and with limited success. And wasn't until the 90s that I sold them some things. But then I do like a run of pitching to them, sell one cartoon, and then pitch to them for 6 months without selling anything and give up. And then I came back to it, leading up, actually, as it turned out, to the 2016 election. And gag cartoons seemed appropriate to address the insanity of Trump coming up, and that led into more editorial cartoons. And though a lot of what I was doing ended up making it to the New Yorker, and I was able to sort of straddle a gag cartoon and a editorial political cartoon in the same breath, because they do crisscross a lot. But it's an ideal form because you can play with irony. You can show one thing in the image and have the text say something else that contradicts it. There's so many different ways. And also when you get into the level of insanity that we have been at for a while, that cartooning is a really good form it's an immediate form. First of all, you can go like read something in the newspaper, draw something about it, get it out. I mean, especially, with the internet, you can have it posted if nothing else, but pitch it around to the, well, three places maybe that you can find. It's a limited market, granted, but I can still get my work out. And I feel, even though it's one of those things, I'm always feeling depressed by how ineffectual it all seems to be in terms of, I co-founded the magazine World War III Illustrated when I was in art school with Seth, my friend from Cleveland, and we've been doing it now. A new issue is coming out next month. That's our 43rd year. The secret to our success, and I'm not sure this is a business model, but no one's ever been paid, but we end up putting money into it to make it run some of the time. But it's been an outlet for maybe longer form pieces that are talking about political issues. And it was our response to the fact that the underground comics movement had died, and there was no outlet for this kind of, for the comics that I was reading that really inspired me, comics like Slow Death, and some of the horror comics, but what Crumb was doing, which a lot of it, there was sex and drugs, but there was a lot of politics in that as well, just by its nature, or more, adamantly so. And those were, that mishmash of things. I wanted to do the same thing, and having done a fanzine, we were like, we don't have to wait around for somebody to give us permission. We can self-publish and do that. And here we are. And there's maybe 30 people that are involved in the magazine, rotating editorial board. Different people come in who basically have the same sentiment, which is that we feel absolutely desperate to talk about what the fuck is going on. That's this horrifying shit show of insane lies and destruction of the planet. And that seems like a worthy topic for comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the power of literature to comment and to kind of draw attention and say, look at these things that are happening.
And the music does that. I mean, the things that I grew up on that made me want to do what I ended up doing, it's other artists, doing that, listening to certain kinds of music that was, radical and also incredibly nurturing and inspiring to, like, yeah, get out there in the street. Yeah, don't, let be crushed by these horrific systems. And underground comics were loaded with that, and that growing up through the Vietnam era and the hippie era. Sadly, I hadn't hit puberty when Summer of Love was happening. Shedang always felt like my generation was always like just arriving at the beach in time for the medical waste to wash up. I was like, we were almost there. I could have, but I managed to do enough drugs to fill in the blank, I think, and associate with that period. And also, a lot of that, I believe in what those movements were about. The hippie movement and all, which often gets denigrated as just sort of like this, it was a fallacy. I really think that that has been promoted in many ways. That's been promoted, that these things don't move the needle, and I have to believe that they do, and I still continue doing what I do out of a sense of, yeah, well, it changed my life for the better,
Absolutely.
and that's a torch worth carrying.
Yeah, I was gonna say something about kernels of truth in satire, but I think it's more like kernels doesn't do it. It's more like grenades of truth that you can find in satire sometimes, I think, that speak so powerfully.
Yeah, I mean, even if it just blows up something in your mind and makes you go like, oh, wait a minute, wow, they're screwing us every time we turn around.
Yep.
That person's lying to you, and they are the institution that's supposed to be telling the truth. And I mean, Mad Magazine did that for me in a big way. Of course, it's like I learned a lot about the possibilities of comics speaking truth to power through Mad, and
Mhm.
with humor. And that's one of the things that also happily stuck with me. I mean, I think there is artwork by a lot of great artists that is just, it's a punch in the face, and there's nothing funny about it, and that can work too. But I really do love the sugar coated, um, glove with the same punch, but you're laughing, and then you're like, wait a minute, that rattled my brain in a good way. So that's another one of those. And again, I think it's an aspect of art and comics that can really do that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So as we come up to our last couple of minutes, um, and kind of the end of the episode, I know you said you have World War III coming, the ongoing
I don't
book
like the way
series.
that sounds,
Yeah,
but that's
true, true. A new issue of
just a
World War
new
Three.
issue.
Let me
Yeah,
say
it's
that.
been, I think it's issue 53.
Mhm.
Um, well, so in reference what I was alluding to earlier, so the last 3 years I've been working on a book called Intersects that is a history of insects and the people who studied them in the past. Um, as a It'll be a couple hundred-page graphic novel. It will take me 4 years to complete it, and huge amount of research. And another beautiful thing is I've connected with entomologists, like the top entomologists studying bees and cicadas and dragonflies from the Natural History Museum here, say. And I've made friends with them, and they've opened up their collections, and I've gotten to photograph things. So I have great reference. I spent a year, I got a fellowship at the New York Public Library, and that's where I started this project. And the whole story takes place inside the library. And it happened that COVID had hit. And when I got this fellowship, normally it would have been a crowded library and all that, and it was empty. And it inspired the notion of like, oh, these empty halls of the library could be a perfect place for the insects to congregate and check out books and exhibitions about their history. And then humans are gone, and the insects are telling their own story, and they're actually talking and all that. So and I'm here I am in my third year on the book, and I feel like it's so exciting to work on it. Like, and I have no slowing down, and that's that combo passion thing colliding. And because of what's going on with insects, which is there's an insect apocalypse, in fact, happening, and there's a huge die off. And I'd like to think that people are coming around to recognizing the importance of insects of all stripes. You wouldn't have chocolate without a certain kind of fly. The no-see-ums, in fact, that's
Oh
biting
wow.
midge.
Wow.
Yeah, they pollinate chocolate with cacao. And there's a long list of things like that, but grocery stores would be empty if it weren't for insects. There'd be bodies and waste everywhere if it weren't for flies and dung beetles and all these fabulous creatures. So I'm been knee deep in that, and I have another year to go. Happily, I'm not actually in any rush for it to be over, although I, in a year it'll be good timing, and that's going to come out in May of 2025. So it's got a little distance to go. I do a weekly strip for Charlie Hebdo, which is the French magazine where 12 cartoonists were assassinated by insane religious fanatics back in 2015.
Mhm.
I do a wordless comic on the environment for them, and I'm also syndicated through Kaggle uh, uh, cartoons, also which is also political uh, cartoons.com. Anyway, and I'm going to be teaching at Harvard in the fall.
Oh wow. Lots of things. Lots of
Yes,
things to come. Wow. Well, thank you in the midst of all of that for taking time to talk with me and share
absolutely, my
about your
pleasure.
work and the complexity of comics. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.